Late afternoon, an industrial engine plant. Inside the workshop, a high-stakes presentation is underway. Victor Langford, the arrogant CEO, unveils an experimental engine to elite investors. In the back, 43-year-old Ethan Cole stands with his 9-year-old son. The boy asks, "Dad, is that the one you told me about?" Victor mocks them. Who designed this thing? Because whoever did clearly didn't think about efficiency. The room snickers. Ethan stays silent, asking a surgical technical question. Suddenly, the ceiling vibrates. A helicopter lands. A high-ranking officer steps out and looks straight at Ethan. "There you are. We need you." Listen carefully. The room changes now. Ethan Cole was a man who spoke the language of steel, friction, and thermodynamics. At 43, his face was a quiet map of focus and resilience, etched with the subtle lines of a man who spent his nights staring at complex fluid dynamics and his days raising a son in a world that didn't bother to see him. He wasn't a man of labels, silk ties, or flashy keynote presentations. He drove a modest truck with a rusted tailgate, wore off-the-rack work shirts, and valued the internal integrity of a machine over the expensive high-gloss shine of its casing. Ethan was an independent mechanical consultant, a ghost engineer for high-performance systems. He was the person companies called when their top-tier teams hit a wall they couldn't climb. To the general public, he was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But to his 9-year-old son, Lucas, he was the man who could explain exactly how the wind moved the entire world. Lucas was his anchor. Since Ethan's wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years ago, their bond had become unbreakable. They spent their weekends in a small home garage, not playing video games, but reading old technical manuals and watching slowed-down videos of jet turbines. "Engineering is mostly quiet work, Lucas," Ethan would say, ruffling the boy's hair while wiping grease from a wrench. "The loudest part of a machine is usually the part that's failing. The best parts, they just do their job in the dark, without asking for credit." They were at the Langford Power Systems plant today because of an urgent whispered invitation from an old colleague, Marcus, who worked on the engineering floor. Marcus was a brilliant man, but he was drowning. He knew the company was struggling with their new V9 prototype and desperately needed a pair of real eyes to look at the cooling architecture before the investors pulled the plug. Marcus had told Ethan, "Just come and look. Don't say a word unless you have to." The workshop was a cathedral of glass, steel, and cold ambition. As Ethan and Lucas walked through the bays, the scent of expensive industrial lubricant and floor wax hit them like a wall. It was a place designed to make people feel small, to remind them of the hierarchy of wealth. Ethan felt only curiosity. Lucas, however, was wide-eyed. He pointed at the massive engine on the test bed, recognizing the layout from his father's midnight sketches on the kitchen table. The sales team and the senior executives, dressed in Italian suits that cost more than Ethan's monthly consulting fees, completely ignored the man and the boy. They were busy attending to the legitimate guests, men with heavy gold watches and aggressive, booming voices. Victor Langford, the CEO, was a man who worshipped the big picture, but rarely understood the underlying physics of his own products. He viewed the factory as a stage for his ego, a place where he could perform his version of genius. When Victor saw Ethan and Lucas standing near his prized prototype, his professional smile turned into a thin, jagged line of irritation. He saw a commoner distracting from his perfect, high-gloss landscape. He didn't see the man who had solved the thermal sink issues for the very aerospace engines that kept the country's defense systems in the sky. He decided to use them as a prop for his own perceived brilliance, a target for his sharp tongue. He had no idea that the invisible man in the back was the only one who actually knew why the V9 was about to become a pile of molten metal. Victor Langford thrived on a specific type of control. He believed that authority was established by who you could make feel unimportant in a room full of people. He walked toward Ethan and Lucas, his designer shoes clicking a sharp, rhythmic beat on the polished concrete. The group of investors followed him, sensing a moment of high-stakes social theater, a welcome distraction from the dry technical stats. "Excuse me, sir," Victor began, his voice carrying that specific polite ice that is far more insulting then a direct shout. I'm afraid we have a very sensitive floor today. This engine is a proprietary marvel, a billion-dollar secret. It isn't exactly for casual tourists. It's for serious partners who understand the heavy cost of innovation. Perhaps the gift shop in the lobby is more your speed? He looked pointedly at Ethan's scuffed leather boots and then at Lucas's school backpack. A few of the VIPs chuckled. One man, adjusting his diamond cufflinks, let out a shallow, patronizing laugh. Maybe they have a museum tour for the kids, Victor? Let's keep the floor clear for the adults. Ethan straightened his posture. He didn't pull Lucas back. He didn't look at the floor in shame. He looked at Victor with a calm, analytical gaze. The same gaze he used when a turbine failed under extreme thermal stress. He wasn't angry for himself, but he felt a sharp, protective pang for Lucas, who had suddenly gone quiet, his excitement dimming. "We're not here for a tour, Victor," Ethan said simply. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to settle the air in the room, making the ambient music feel unnecessary. "My son is interested in the fluid dynamics of the intake. He noticed the bypass valve is positioned unusually for an engine of this displacement. He thought it looked inefficient." Victor's smirk widened, dripping with a condescending irony. "Bypass valves. That's charming, really. But reading a magazine in a waiting room doesn't make you an expert on the V9. Who designed this engine?" "I did, along with the most elite team of PhDs in the country. And whoever you were talking to clearly didn't think about airflow balance. Because this design is, quite frankly, perfect." The mockery was absolute. He was telling them they were a waste of oxygen in a room worth billions. Ethan looked at the engine display behind him, a silver cutaway of the prototype's heart. His eyes scanned the magnesium alloy tubes and the complex wiring looms. He noticed a detail that the glossy marketing brochures had carefully omitted, a shadow in the thermal map that suggested a catastrophic oversight. "If the airflow balance is perfect," Ethan asked, stepping closer to the machine, "why did you test it under such a low thermal load during the demo? The sensors are reading 70 degrees, but at high RPMs, that manifold is going to experience a vortex blockage in the secondary radiators. The heat won't have anywhere to go. It will choke." The room went deathly quiet. A lead technician, who had been monitoring the live data on a tablet, stopped his screen and turned around, his eyes wide. Victor blinked. He had spent 2 weeks memorizing the sales script, but he didn't actually know what a vortex blockage was in this context. He knew the price and the 0 to 60 time, but he didn't know the soul of the machine. "It's the standard high-performance cooling loop," Victor replied, his tone becoming sharp, defensive, and desperate. "As I said, it's not something for amateur discussion. It's highly classified engineering. Now please move toward the exit before I have security assist you and your son out." Ethan shook his head slowly, a faint, knowing smile appearing on his lips. "Actually, it's not standard. By placing the intake here, you're creating a low-pressure zone that traps heat against the battery bank. If you run this at full capacity for more than 10 minutes, the entire logic board will melt. It's not a bug in the code, Victor. It's a misunderstanding of basic physics. You're fighting gravity, and gravity never loses." Lucas looked up at his dad, his eyes starting to glow with pride again. "Is that why the red line on the screen moves so fast, Dad? Like the puzzle we fixed in the garage last week?" Ethan smiled and ruffled Lucas's hair. "Exactly, pal. They're trying to force the air where it doesn't want to go." Victor's face flushed a deep, angry red. He felt his carefully curated authority slipping in front of his most important clients. The investors were whispering. The silence was heavy. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to leave immediately. You're disrupting a multi-million-dollar presentation with technical nonsense you likely misread on a blog. Security, get them out." Kini. The investors were no longer laughing. They were looking at the engine, then at Ethan, then back at Victor with growing suspicion. The nobody in the simple shirt had just asked a question that the CEO of the company couldn't answer. The tension was at its breaking point. Victor reached for his radio. his hand trembling with a mix of ego and professional embarrassment. But before the security guards could reach them, the world outside the factory changed. The argument in the workshop was suddenly drowned out by a sound that made the thick window panes rattle in their steel frames. It was a low-frequency, rhythmic thumping, the unmistakable heavy sound of large rotor blades cutting through the humid afternoon air. The noise grew into a deafening roar as a massive dark shadow swept across the workshop's skylights, momentarily blocking out the sun. Everyone in the room, from the billionaire investors to the lowliest intern, turned toward the windows. A high-end aerospace transport helicopter, painted in a tactical matte black, was descending toward the factory's small private helipad just 50 yards from the main doors. It wasn't a corporate bird, it was a military-grade machine. "What is this?" Victor shouted over the noise, his irritation turning into genuine confusion. "I didn't authorize any landings today. Who is trespassing on my property?" The helicopter touched down with a cloud of dust and gravel. Within seconds, the main cabin door slid open. 3 men stepped out. 2 were technicians in dark aerospace uniforms, but the third was a man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored military-style blazer. He walked with an urgency that suggested every second was worth a fortune. The group marched straight toward the workshop entrance, ignoring the security guards who were too stunned to stop them. Victor Langford adjusted his tie and smoothed his hair, assuming this was some high-level surprise inspection or a potential military contract finally arriving to save his company. He stood as tall as he could, his ego preparing to take center stage once again. "Gentlemen," Victor called out as they entered the building, "I am Victor Langford, CEO. You've arrived during a very important unveiling. If you could just wait in the executive lounge, I'll be with you." The man in the blazer didn't even look at him. He didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge the V9 engine or the group of wealthy investors. He scanned the room with a laser-like focus until his eyes landed on the man in the back row, the man in the scuffed boots and the simple, faded shirt. The team stopped exactly 3 feet from Ethan Cole. The man in the blazer stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Ethan's with a look of profound relief. Then he did something that made every jaw in the workshop drop. He took a deep, respectful breath and spoke. "Ethan," the man said, his voice hushed but carrying through the now silent room. "Ethan Cole, we've been looking for you for 6 hours. Your old firm said you'd gone completely off the grid to be a full-time dad. I almost didn't believe them." Ethan gave a small, humble nod, his hand still on Lucas's shoulder. "I'm on my own time now, General. I have different priorities these days. My son has a soccer game on Tuesday at Kanowam." The general didn't care about the decor, the expensive wine, or the wealthy clients watching. He reached out and gripped Ethan's hand with both of his, shaking it with an intensity that suggested a deep, unbreakable history of survival. "We have a crisis at the propulsion lab across the valley. The new turbine cooling system, the one you designed the base architecture for 5 years ago, it's failing. We hit a thermal feedback loop that our most advanced computers can't even simulate. The team is paralyzed. We need the man who knows the soul of the machine. We need you now, Ethan. The mission is grounded without you." Victor Langford stepped forward, his voice a shaky, high-pitched whisper. "General, sir, do you actually know this man? He was trespassing. He's a maintenance mechanic. He doesn't belong here." The general turned to Victor, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of steel that made the CEO physically flinch. "Know him?" the general asked, his voice booming through the glass hall, vibrating the windows. "Victor, you're standing in a workshop where half the designs on your wall probably came from this man's discarded research. Ethan Cole was the lead thermodynamic architect for the Skyguard engine project. He is the reason our defense jets don't drop out of the sky when they hit Mach speed. He didn't just think about efficiency, Mr. Langford. He defined it for the entire global industry." The silence that followed was absolute. The man who had been told he wasn't appropriate for the room was revealed as the man who had built the industry. The investors shifted uncomfortably. The man who had laughed earlier, now looking intensely at his own shoes, wishing he could disappear into the concrete. The general looked down at Lucas, who was staring at the black helicopter with wide-eyed shock and wonder. "And who is this? A new propulsion engineer in training? He has the cold look. Ethan smiled, his hand resting firmly and proudly on Lucas's shoulder. This is Lucas. He's the reason I'm not at your propulsion lab today, General. He's my primary supervisor. We're working on his science project. It's about how to keep engines from melting. The truth began to ripple through the room like a shock wave. 4 years ago, Ethan Cole had been at the absolute untouchable pinnacle of his career. He was the only engineer the military trusted with the most sensitive, classified engine designs. But when his wife had fallen ill, Ethan didn't hesitate for a single second. He walked away from the secret clearances, the 7-figure bonuses, and the power. He moved back to his hometown to be a father. He chose a life of aggressive simplicity so that Lucas would never have to wonder where his dad was at 6 p.m. Ethan, the general said, his tone turning pleading, I know your rules, I know your schedule, but if that turbine melts, the whole project goes back 3 years. I have the chopper ready. We'll have you back by dinner. I'll even let the boy sit in the jump seat and wear the headset. Ethan looked at Lucas. The boy gave a frantic, enthusiastic nod, his eyes pleading. I'll give you 2 hours, General, Ethan said with a playful wink. But only if you explain to my son why you chose a titanium alloy for the rotor blades instead of carbon fiber. He thinks your weight-to-heat ratio is off for high-altitude deployment. The general laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the cathedral of steel. Lucas, come with me. Let's talk about titanium. It's a lot more interesting than these people in suits anyway. They talk about money. We talk about magic. As they walked toward the black helicopter, the nobody in the simple jacket was no longer a shadow in the corner. He was the architect. He was the master. And Victor Langford was finally watching with his hat off and his mouth closed, realizing that he had just mocked the man who held his entire future in his hands. The atmosphere in the workshop had shifted from an exclusive club to a masterclass in humility. The investors who 10 minutes ago were snickering at a tourist were now leaning in over the barriers, desperate to catch a single word of what Ethan had said. They realized that the real power in the room wasn't the man with the loudest voice or the most expensive watch. It was the man who actually understood how the world worked. Victor Langford stood in the center of his factory floor, his professional armor completely shattered. He watched through the glass as Ethan, Lucas, and the general walked toward the waiting chopper. He looked back at his V9 engine. The one he had boasted was perfect. And for the first time, he saw the shadows Ethan had mentioned. He saw the flaws. He saw the vanity of his own design. He felt a deep, biting sense of shame. He took a deep, shaky breath, straightened his designer jacket, and walked toward the exit. He caught up to them just as Ethan was helping Lucas into the helicopter. Victor didn't approach as a CEO this time. He approached as a man who had just received a very expensive lesson in reality. Ethan, he said, waiting for a pause in the rotor noise. Ethan turned, his expression neutral. He didn't hold a grudge. He had seen many men like Victor in the boardrooms of defense contractors, people who mistook the title for the talent. I want to apologize, Victor said, his voice quiet but steady. I was incredibly short-sighted. I judged you by the surface, by the uniform of your life today, and I was profoundly wrong. I hope you can forgive my arrogance. I would value your thoughts on the V9 if you ever have a moment. On your terms. Not as a consultant, but as a peer. I want to learn what I missed. Ethan nodded once, a brief, respectful acknowledgement. It's all right, Victor. In my world, we call that a calibration error. You were simply measuring the wrong variables to determine the output. It happens to the best of us. Just remember that the person asking the most questions is often far more important than the person giving the rehearsed answers. Titles don't fix turbines. Victor nodded, a genuine, humble smile touching his lips for the first time that day. I'll remember that. Thank you. The general looked up from the cockpit, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his headset. Recalibrated the room, have you, Ethan? Good. Now let's go save a billion-dollar turbine before it becomes a paperweight. For the next 2 hours while the helicopter carried them across the scenic valley, the maintenance guy was a lead designer again. He didn't give grand speeches. He led by asking questions. He asked for the raw data, not the executive summary. He listened to the pitch of the engines. He was in his element, but he never let go of Lucas's hand. Back at the factory, Victor didn't go back to the wine and the party. He went straight to the technical bay. He pulled his lead engineers together and, for the first time in the company's history, he didn't tell them what to do. He didn't demand a launch date. He simply asked them, "What did the man in the back row see that we missed? Let's start from the thermal load and forget the marketing brochure." Ethan realized that the most powerful thing he had done that day wasn't fixing a turbine. It was showing Victor that you could be a leader without being a tyrant. He had proven that expertise didn't mean sacrificing your life on the altar of the corporation. It meant being so good at your craft that you could define your own boundaries and still be the most valuable person in the room. By the time the helicopter returned to the factory helipad, the sun was setting, painting the skyscrapers in brilliant shades of liquid gold and oxidized copper. The mission had been a staggering success, a simple 3-degree adjustment to the cooling flow, exactly as Ethan had suspected from the initial data. The general walked Ethan to his old truck. "I still need a chief of strategic propulsion, Ethan. The offer's always there. No travel. Full remote. You can even build a lab in your garage. Just your brain when we hit a wall we can't see through." Ethan looked at Lucas, who was clutching a small, heavy model of the black helicopter the technicians had given him. "I appreciate the offer, General. I really do. But I've already got the best job in the world. I'm a dad, and right now my boss wants to go get some chocolate ice cream to celebrate his A on that science project. That's the only milestone that matters tonight." The general laughed, a firm, silent promise of a lifelong friendship. "Fair enough, Ethan. But don't be a stranger. The air gets too thin up there without you to balance the oxygen." The sun had completely disappeared behind the horizon as Ethan and Lucas drove home. The city lights were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars, reflecting off the hood of the old truck. Lucas was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the distant, flickering lights of the industrial zone, where his life had just changed. "Dad?" Lucas asked softly, his voice full of thought. "Yes, pal. Why didn't you tell that man you were a hero? You knew more than all of them combined. You could have made him feel really, really small for being so mean to us." Ethan pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. He took a moment to find the right words, the ones that would stick with Lucas forever. Because being right isn't about making others feel small, Lucas. It's about making the machine run better. If I had told him I was a general's consultant just to make him shut up, I would have been acting out of pride. But by letting the idea speak for itself, I was acting out of truth. Truth is much stronger than pride. He looked at his son, his gaze serious but infinitely kind in the dim dashboard light. True expertise, real knowledge. It doesn't need a uniform, and it doesn't need to shout to be seen. It just stays calm and silent until the moment it's actually needed to solve a problem. Remember what happened when the chopper arrived? The CEO didn't look at my boots anymore. He looked at the people who were following me. He saw the truth. That's what you should aim for, pal. Be so good at what you do. Be so honest in your work that people remember your integrity, not your outfit. Lucas thought about this for a long moment, clutching his helicopter model. He looked at the drawing on his lap, the one of the engine with the magic wings. Do you think he'll listen to the next dad who comes in with a question, even if his shoes are dirty? I think he learned a lesson today that no business school could ever teach him, Ethan replied. He learned that you never truly know who is standing in front of you. Always respect the person asking questions about your work, Lucas, because they might be the only ones in the room who are actually listening to what you're trying to say. Wisdom comes from listening, not talking. They walked into their small, warm house. They didn't talk about billionaire CEOs, tactical helicopters, or multi-million-dollar contracts. They talked about the turbo boost button they were going to add to the science project presentation board using a recycled spring and some old wire. That evening, as Ethan tucked Lucas into bed, the boy looked up with sleepy but focused eyes. "I'm going to design an engine one day, Dad. A really, really fast one. One that stays cool no matter how fast it goes. And I'll build it in our garage." Ethan smiled and kissed his son's forehead. "I know you will, pal. I have no doubt about it. You already see the shadows better than I do. Ethan sat in the quiet of their living room for a long time after that, listening to the soft sounds of the night. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had been rejected by a CEO and honored by a general in the same afternoon. He realized that the greatest luxury in the entire world wasn't the private jets, the power, or the high-stakes contracts he had left behind. It was the peace of mind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the rest of the world has no idea. True expertise doesn't need to be proven to strangers. It just needs to stay calm until the truth decides to speak for itself. Ethan Cole went to sleep that night knowing that he wasn't just an engineer. He was a father. And that was the only title that would ever truly matter in the final lap of his life. If you believe that a person's value isn't defined by the price of their clothes, but by the integrity of their work, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged before people knew your story? How did you react?